Thank you all for having me. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm honored to be virtually here with you today and just so humbled to be giving this keynote talk. And of course, special thanks to the organizers, Dr. Jesse Moore, the Center for Engaged Learning, and Dr. Christina Whitstein. I just really appreciate all the work that's gone on into making this happen. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful. So I will be talking about the concept of community, and I apologize in advance for using the very academic-esque word complicating that falls under that whole umbrella of like complicating, problematizing, all those things that we like to toss around. And really what I just want to talk about is just thinking critically about the concept of community. And I've been thinking about community quite a bit and mulling over the idea of community as a concept, as space plays, as connected to identity and advocacy. And it's not something new for me, but rather it's something that I just keep returning to, coming back to over and over again during my time as a scholar. And it started when I actually remember entering graduate school and hearing things from professors and colleagues and peers. Like, this is where you learn to contribute and be a part of a community scholars. This is the welcome to the community, all of those kinds of things. And being a first generation um, graduate student, I was like, okay, what does that mean? Well, I don't quite know what a community of scholars means. And so the idea of community has always struck me as something that within the walls of academia, I should say, has been hard for me to pin down. And it was very difficult for me to identify with for quite some time. And I think that part of the reason that I keep coming back to this concept of community is because I want to know what it means for academia and what it means for outside of academia, and where those tensions are, where the alignment is, and how this idea about what community is, how it functions, and how it tracks between spaces, places, and contexts. Um, so I just want to talk a little bit about intentionality and how we use the word community and how we expect and look for our students to engage with us, with each other, when we ask them to be in community or build community in our classrooms or write about their communities. What does this word mean for us? What does it mean to us? And what does it mean for our students? So over the past few months, as I've mentioned, I've been turning and returning to my reflections about community in informal and formal conversations that I've been having. And so I'll try and share some of those with y'all and just invite y'all to think again with me about the concept of community. So I guess one of the things that re-triggered me thinking about community was a few weeks ago. I met for the first time with a graduate student where I was going to be moving on to her committee. And we ended up talking about the courses that she was teaching and exams. And somehow, eventually, we ended up talking about how I had recently moved to mid Michigan during the pandemic. And I'm an open book most of the time. And so the concept of community came up because I mentioned that I felt a bit afloat because I felt like I left a really robust and supportive community in Florida where I was moving from. And so we began to talk about community and how we use this word with our students in the classroom. And for instance, this idea came up that what do we mean when we say we're building community within the classroom? And one of the things that we said was like students might not understand what it means when we say we want to build community in a classroom context, or when we say, you know, we want them to talk about their communities and these certain ways that are structured within the context, because students' ideas of what community is, as well as our own ideas of what community is, can vary wildly. And so when we say build community or even ask students to talk about the communities they belong to, we often just kind of fall back into this kind of academic speak of the idea of what community might be or what a community is expected to be. And in other words, our ideas about what community is, what's acceptable in a community, what counts as a community, what counts as power in community, how that functions in the community, it always influences the ways we present the concept of community to our students, whether we realize that or not. And so we possibly discount some experiences about what community is and how community functions by just kind of tossing that word out there and only thinking about it from within an academic kind of context. And so, what's more, when we leave no room for questioning about tensions within communities, or the tensions we often feel in communities, the good stuff for sure, but also the harm that's done in communities, we tend to present communities as this unequivocal positive thing. I want you to write about this community that you're a part of and how you participate in it and how you engage in it. Those kinds of comments that we tend to talk to our students. But it's not always the case, right? And so, in chatting with this graduate student, one of the metaphors that came up when we were thinking about the difference between communities was, okay, there's a big difference between when you're riding down the freeway and you see these large, huge gated communities versus these smaller, more organic neighborhoods, right? So, for instance, when we think about how some gated communities function with gates and guards and mechanisms to keep the right folks in and the wrong folks out, right? How does that differ from a neighborhood community center that's welcoming to all? And how does those ideas and metaphors about community crop up when we just toss out the word community to our students, right? So this idea of balancing what a community affords and what a community constrains comes to the fore. And we're challenged to think about a community as complicated, right? Rather than always good or always bad. And understanding sometimes our students might not even want to engage with these ideas of community that we present in the classroom in these academic contexts. So as I began to draft this talk, one question that formed for me was, how do we as academics conceive of communities in various spaces and places? And then what are the ways that we can conceive a community and shift ideas about things like writing and power and advocacy and engagement for our students? So essentially, I'm curious about this kind of elevated and often, and not always, but often unproblematic way that we talk about community and how we hold up the concept of community without thinking critically about it, about how academia has taken up the concept for better or worse. And I'm including myself in that, even coming in as a graduate student saying, I don't know what this means. But then years later saying, oh, I want to build community in my online classes, right? So just realizing that I have also done this kind of uncritical tossing out of the word. And so I think also with my focus on technical communication and activism, I often use the term community, and it always gives me pause because then I'm like, do I need to say what I mean when I say community, or how do I need to define community? And how it's so hard to gauge how others hear that word or perceive that word or understand that term without me being very deliberate and explicit about how I take up the term. So when I say complicate the concept of community, I really mean that I want us, myself included, to think more carefully and critically about how we deploy the term itself. And so rather than yammer on and on and on about how I've been thinking about community, I thought it'd be a good idea just to share some of the questions that I'm considering. And I hope that you all can consider and think through these ideas with me, collaboratively with me. And then maybe throughout the talk, jot notes, and I'll offer some of my insights. But I'm curious what y'all are thinking at the end, and hoping you will mull over these things with me. Um, so to start, here's some questions that I have, and some questions I continue to grapple with and turn to again and again. And then I'll share a couple of ideas about what I think, and then hopefully we'll have a robust kind of chat. Um, so the first question I began, of course, was like, how do we as academics define community? And then how do I define community for myself? And how does that differ when I'm talking about community with my group of friends or with my family or, with folks I just meet? And then how do our students think about community? How do they define it for themselves? And how does it differ when we ask them to define community in the classroom? Finally, what do we understand about how community operates, how power operates in community, how empowerment operates, how culture, advocacy, identity operates in community? I think definition is important, but the operation of it is so telling about how we define it. And that led me to thinking about things like, well, how does what does community mean for multiply marginalized folks? What does community mean for Black folks? What does community mean for folks who are not readily invited into these elitist academic spaces? How does the expectation of how community operates differ when we frame it outside of a white heteropatriarchal elitist academic context? And when we bring all of these things into the classroom, when we drop a big word like community, what are our expectations for the responses that we get from our students? Um, but outside of all of those kind of questions, I think what I'm most interested in is what can we learn and who can we learn from about this concept of community. So I think as we push our field, writing studies broadly, tech com for me, or rhetoric, writing, composition in general, as we push our field to engage with these issues of like inclusion and activism and social justice, just wanting us to think more carefully about the models that allow us to engage with ideals regarding community. Um, and a lot of that has to do with the necessary collectivist organization or orientation to doing inclusion and activist work. Like it has to be done collectively. Does that mean it must be done in community? What other words could we use, or what other concepts can we use to kind of frame that? So thinking about community, I feel, is really connected to these ideas of inclusion and activism in our fields because of this collectivist orientation that is needed and able to do liberation and activist work. So Loretta Powell, who is actually the author of, I don't want to mess up the name. I think it's Progressive Community Organizing is the name of her book. I like Piles. Piles does some really interesting work around the concept of community via the lens of community organizing. And I think that that's a great place to start when we think about community and engaged learning, and specifically in our field, what engaged learning, engaged writing might mean. And I've turned to often using piles to my in my classroom so that my students can begin to think about, what do I mean when I say community, right? What do I mean when I say community engagement and how that relates to their writing? So I often assign piles for the students to read, like the first chapter where they actually say, here's what I mean by community. Here's the different tensions and alignments in the community. Here is what I mean when I say power and community. And so, even though my courses don't all necessarily have a social justice, and I'm going to use air quotes, focus, my pedagogy, like my research, strives to be justice centered and liberatory. And I think PILES helps me to do some of that revelatory work for myself and my students. And what I like about PILES is that they acknowledge the complexities of defining community. So, for instance, PILES states that, and this is a quote, the notion of community harkens a wide range of ideas, including trust, mutuality, commitment, and solidarity, as well as the ideas of contestation, conflict, and exclusion, right? So, all these kinds of conflicting and ideas that are in tension when you mention community, right? So when we're encouraging community in our classrooms or asking students to think about community, are we also engaging with this idea of community in critical ways that acknowledges the ways that community affords certain folks certain power, but constrains power in other places, includes certain folks, but excludes certain folks, has certain expectations for what is normal or right and good versus something that is seen as not as good, advantageous, or unvalued. And what's more, are we making visible the ways that community and ideas about communities can stir mixed emotions and responses and perspectives from our students, depending on how they've engaged in their own communities, or how they've been invited in certain communities, or pushed out of certain communities, or centered in different community activities and experiences. So, community is, in the way that Piles thinks about it, and in the way that I think, evolving to think about it, it's more than just doing some things together, right? It's more than just a group with similar interests and that's it. It's more than just being co-located in geographical spaces. It's more than just saying, hey, I am, part of a woman of a community of Black women feminists, right? It's there's all of these other dynamics that happens within communities, and ideals like trust, like conflict, like commitment have to be grappled with in order to actually get at what a community is, what a community does, and what are the possibilities for transformation and change within a community. So, in regard to writing and engaged learning and thinking about engaged learning and writing for change and liberation in our classrooms, and that work that we try to do when we're thinking about justice-centered pedagogy, liberatory pedagogies, I come to realize that the community is something that is not a natural understanding for everybody. It's not a natural understanding for our students to understand what we mean, and we might not automatically understand what our students mean. So instead, I've been toying with, and this is something I've been working with my co-authors when we wrote our book. Um, Instead, seeing coalitions and coalitional learning as a productive and fruitful kind of inroads to thinking carefully about what we're asking our students and what we mean when we say community. And it wasn't until I reflected on a course that I taught and published an article about years and years ago that I realized that I might be seeing developments of coalitions in my classroom rather than the development of communities. Um, so here's what happened. Years ago, I taught a grant and proposal writing course for students that were in a writing and rhetoric program. Some of them were technical and professional communicators, rhetoricians, compositionists. And because of my interest in activism and in particular at that time, wrongful conviction, I reached out to work with the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project is an organization that's pro bono, nonprofit, that works and operates in different states to work for the exoneration of wrongfully convicted individuals and just to bring to the fore awareness and education around wrongful conviction. And so at the time, I was really, really invested in working with the Innocence Project. I just finished up my dissertation program, my dissertation project that worked with the Innocence Project. And I reached out to partner with the local states Innocence and Justice Project so that my students would be able to contextualize their grant and proposal writing. And I kind of wanted a service learning orientation with this liberatory focus. And the Innocence and Justice Project was just perfect at that time for working with my students. And so my focus at the time, and I've written about this, was all about service learning is social justice service learning, critical service learning that encourage professional writing students to see themselves as change agents while emphasizing social justice perspectives in technical and professional communication pedagogy. So my students ended up working in teams along with myself and the director of the Innocence and Justice Project in that state to apply for private and public grants. And so the director would come in and chat with the students and sit with them and work with them. I would sit with them and work with them. We would send drafts. There was this really great open communication. It was a small class. So it was like four small teams of like 3 or 4 students. Um, and I was super happy about the turnout. I even argued later in an article at the time that this was the thing, right? This is community engagement. This is community service. This was a way to link our students' work with their communities and build communities within the classrooms and all of that. And I was super excited. And I was like, yay, yay, this is all what community is for me. It's community engagement for me, right? And so, as an academic, sometimes I just return to stuff and I'm like, what the, why did I say that? Right. And so I had one of those moments a few years later and I was like, why did I say that? Like, that's not what I, you know, necessarily believe now. And I think sometimes it's hard for academics, especially when something that's in print and published and read, to be like, what the hell was I saying? Right. So I did have one of those moments and I'm like, wait, this, I don't know. I don't know that what I saw was community, right? And so it just got me thinking again more and more about how we talk about, academic spaces and places and contexts that don't necessarily privilege or value community in ways that, you know, community is valued or understood outside of academia in these tangible and material ways that can create difficulties for scholars who are interested in this work to do this work. And this is especially true for marginalized scholars and scholars of color and scholars who are not tenured and scholars who are just starting out and graduate students, right? And so I don't want to take anything away from my students. They were amazing. My students did great work. They developed excellent proposals. The director and I were all happy with it. But in the article, I just wasn't sure I was seeing community when I looked back at it. And the article included student reflections that noted about how, students noted how excited they were to work and that they really liked working in their teams. They really liked talking with the innocence justice director, project director. They really like learning about wrongful conviction. It was a success. I won't say that it wasn't a success because it was. But when I revisited it years later, it made me really question what connections was I seeing. I definitely saw collaboration. I definitely saw connections. I definitely saw these things that we look for, but was it community? And so, even though it was a success by all counts for sure, and I thought initially that this was indicative of building community in the classroom while I was participating in real community engagement, I'm just not sure anymore. And what it seems more to me, especially as I've been thinking more and more about coalitions, is that I saw the start of some coalitions, right? It's the building of coalitions and not necessarily community. And so for me, coalitions differ from community in these nuanced ways where coalitions are often very different groups of people, disparate groups of people, often come together for very strategic purposes, and they are ephemeral. Sometimes they sometimes they stand, sometimes they dissolve when the need is not there anymore. And so in our book, Technical Communication After the Social Justice Term, Building Coalitions for Action, Doctors Rebecca Walton, Kristen Moore, and myself, we draw on Chavez's idea of what a coalition is. And Chavez says her vision of coalitions are less as an existing relationship or thing and more as a possibility for coming together within or to create a juncture that points to change, right? And so it's not something that's necessarily there and you can create and you can build, but there's these possibilities for coming together to work for change, right? And so we also note that in our book that coalitions shift, they change quickly, they engage difference, they have different goals, they're dynamic. Coalitions typically serve a specific purpose, draws in allies, reconfigures divisions of labor as needed. They're not as hierarchical. Coalitions reject perspectives that don't push toward the required or desired change they're looking to make. And coalitions are all about strategic collaboration and collectivity. And that's what I think we're seeing sometimes, or even what we're striving for sometimes in our classrooms and even in our own work, right? And so I think that caused me to then, okay, if I'm seeing this, it made me turn to look at activist work. Like, how are activists showing us what coalitions are? On how they're working and what are they calling coalitions, right? And so I feel like activists have shown us why and how coalitions can be a productive way, just as a productive as thinking communally about community, but coalitions can be just as productive, and how coalitional learning and writing and working together forwards aims of justice and liberation in ways that possibly community can't. And I won't say community can't and coalitions can, or communities can and coalitions can't. I just think it's like something to kind of mull through, right? So, in addition to thinking about how activists, scholars, teachers have demonstrated the importance of coalitional writing and collectively thinking and working in coalition to build new knowledges, and also in order to draw in diverse perspectives and honor different ways of learning and knowing, it also made me think of like this fleeting ephemeral kind of idea of we're in our classroom, we're going to build community now, right? But what happens after, right? People go out to different classrooms, they go do different things. Did we really build community, right? What did we see? What did we see happen? Even in the things that we think were wildly successful. So, in particular, in relation to emphasizing like different knowledges, different ways of working, perspectives of multi marginalized groups, I think Black feminists have modeled approaches to collective action and coalitional writing and publishing, even. And coalitional work that we often aim for, but maybe falls short in academic context, or maybe we just don't know how to name it. And so, one of the things that really sprung to mind when I was thinking through all this was the Kabahi River Collective. And so, in her book, How We Get Free Black Feminism in the Kabahi River Collective, Kianga Yamada Taylor explores the idea of coalitional learning, writing, and knowledge making. And the Kabahi River Collective itself was a group of Black women, scholars, activists, writers, including Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith, right? And they came together in 1974 as a group of Black women led by Barbara Smith and her sister. And they came together as a collective. They called themselves as a collective. And I see this collective as a coalition. And they've actually used the word collective and coalition in very purposeful ways to talk about how they came together and what they did together. And they came together as this collective to address the failures of what they saw as white feminist organizations to adequately respond to racism and the experience of Black women, Black lesbians, um, um, Black folks that the white feminist organizations didn't necessarily pick up, right? And in addition to thinking about Black women, they also talked about how they acted in coalition with other marginalized women. And like then the bell started ringing in my head, right? About what we're seeing when we actually ask our students or try to do this liberatory work for these short amounts of time. Then we pair with people and we work through things and we work through ideas and then we go our separate ways. Um, so the Kabahi River Collective, among other things, some of the interesting things that they did was they turned they current coined the term identity politics, which of course folks have now taken up really uncritically without even knowing its origin and just kind of deploy this term, right? And they also, even before Crenshaw, began focusing on what they termed interlocking oppressions, right? And so they were really trying to disentangle these really wicked problems of feminism and race and marginality and oppression, right? And so when I read the collective's statement and I read Taylor's book and the interviews about the women that established the collective, it really presents a model for us to think about coalitional writing, coalitional learning, coalitional thinking that transforms ideas and makes way for new knowledges and perspectives in this collaborative way. And so the Combahee River Collective called their work specifically, they called it coalition building, where they recognized and embraced difference and politically understood solidarity as a way to, quote, strengthen political commitments from other groups by getting them to recognize how different struggles were related to each other and connected, right? So, in other words, coalitions, in the way that Kabahi River Collective uses the term, works across communities. And I think that is super important. Because then the focus is not necessarily on similarities or in groups or geographic location, or we like the same things, or we align in these ways. Drawing them together to drive specific change in a strategic way. And so for the Combahee River Collective, that change for them was liberation of Black women, and then thus all folks would be liberated through the destruction of what they called all the systems of oppression. So this focus on strategic change and solidarity and difference is how I see coalitions working and operating a bit differently than communities, simply because it is coalitionally across communities, across difference, right? So then my final questions become, can we create coalitions with our students? And what does it mean to create coalitions rather than try to build community. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but just thinking critically about what are we trying to do when we're engaging our students? What are we trying to do when we work with our colleagues? What are we trying to do when we actually go out into communities, right? Are we building community with those? Are we working in coalition with those communities? What are we doing? And what might shift in our pedagogy when we think about coalitional writing and coalitionally engaged writing, and how might that transform how we introduce our students to issues of advocacy and activist writing and change, and not just in our field, but in all things that we do: business writing, technical writing, science writing, usability, user experience, human-centered design, all those things. And then finally, can focusing on coalitions push us toward more just and engaged ways of thinking about what we do in the academy, like not setting ourselves up as these saviors who are going to go into these spaces and create community or build community like it doesn't already exist, right? So, how's that shift in thinking about what we do change how we do it, or how purposeful we are, and what we privilege or don't, what we acknowledge or don't. Um, so here's the kicker: after all of that, I don't have an answer, right? I don't have an answer to any of the questions I posed. Again, it's something I'm mulling over. I'm not sure. And I think that it's okay for me to sit in this uncertainty, because I want to figure out if there is, a right answer, or if there's some conglomeration of answers. But I do want to, for myself, to be more thoughtful and more careful about just saying, hey, I'm building community in my online classroom through these discussion posts, ha ha ha, right? So thinking carefully about those. And then to be honest with myself about how my thinking about community has shifted and changed over time. And I also don't want the takeaway from this to be that we should abandon this idea of community for the concept of coalitions, because I don't think that's productive either. And I don't think it's fruitful. I think it's binary thinking, which never, serves our purposes. So I think that ultimately, I do think that this concept of building coalitions that can reach across communities can be something that we can consider. And so Barbara Smith, one of the founders of the Kabahi River Collective, says that working in coalition for the Kabahi River Collective meant showing up for causes that might not have been expected for her community to show up for. So as a Black woman, things that folks didn't expect her or her group to show up for, working in a coalition means that they showed up. And so that also stuck in my head. And further, Smith reminds us about the role of difference in coalitions, something that I don't know we focus on enough when we think about community, right? So for Smith, and even Audre Lorde has echoed this, embracing difference is a key to coalition building. So if we see coalitions as embracing difference, right? Strategic, goal focused, dynamic and impermanent, localized and driven by a collective agenda that centers marginalized and multiply marginalized folks, we get a different perspective than we do when we think about community. And I think these different perspectives are useful on their own and in their own realms and on their own rights. So I guess it's my hope that as academics like to say, we have complicated how we think about the concept of community a bit, so that we can be more purposeful and clear about what we mean when we use that word in our classroom, when we use it with our student, when we use it outside of academic context. And in other words, I hope that this kind of opens up more space to talk and dialogue and have conversations about how we actually do the work that we want to do in our classrooms and in academia and in our spaces and places that are outside of academia, how we do the work, what we see as valuable, who we invite in, how power works when we deploy certain terms, and just being aware of the different and varied responses that might come up when we uncritically deploy the term coalition or community. So essentially, I would say that the goal for me is when I'm thinking about writing, when I'm thinking about my work, when I'm thinking about my students, the goal for me is to bring together and be more inclusive, make boundaries more permeable, invite more perspectives, share different experiences, right? And so if the concept of communities can get us there, great. If thinking coalitioning can get us there, fantastic. My hope is that either way, we can arrive together. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We did not have the mic on, so you probably couldn't hear all that applause, but there was quite a bit of applause in the room, and I imagine online as well. We do, for our online attendees, please feel free to add questions to the chat, and I'm also going to moderate questions from the room. So if you have one, let me know, I'll bring the mic to you. And if you have one online, please put it in the Q&A and we'll pull from there. I see lots of people mulling things, trying to decide what they want to ask.
Whoa.
Hi, Dr. Jones. Thanks for a really interesting and provocative talk. You got me thinking about time here. And one of the things I'm hearing you say is coalitions are temporary and they're ephemeral, things like this. And so would you contrast that with communities that are more lasting in all this? I guess what I'm wondering is, thinking about my class, what you're saying makes tons of sense. It's not really a community, right? But maybe the major, maybe the program, is it right to be thinking, or is it possible to be thinking of building community, in a longer term thing where we might just have coalitions in classes? Or am I missing some of the nuance in your argument? Thanks.
Thanks. No, thanks for that question. I will say that I don't think coalitions are always ephemeral, but I think they tend to be more ephemeral than communities, which I agree with you. It seems to be more permanent in a sense. And so I think that thinking about time is perfect. And I don't want to say that you can't create community in the classroom, because maybe, again, maybe from my perspective as a professor, maybe I don't see what's happening outside the classroom or how the students are engaging or interacting or whatever. But I think for me, when I asked students, for instance, I'll go back to the example with the Innocence and Justice Project, where I'm like, I want to build community, right? And really, the thing I was saying to them is, I want us to come together and think about wrongful conviction and help push forward this particular thing in this particular time for this particular group, and then go forth, right? I won't say that we can't create community in academic spaces and places, because I think that would be disingenuous. And so I like how you thought about, like, maybe programmatically or as far as the major, because I think that um, maybe that is the key. Maybe it is thinking more long term, beyond just the class, beyond just, one class you take here and then you're gone. But I think that's harder to gauge, and harder to gauge. I should say, I think it's harder to gauge from a perspective where you're going into the classroom and you're teaching this one thing and you're saying, I want to build community. I don't think it's impossible to do it more long term. But the only thing that I would say is, when we think about how we create community in things like a program or a major, we still need to be aware of how power and inclusion and exclusion works in those spaces and places. Because even if, and I say this because I understand that my positionality is one of power, right? And so I can go in and say, hey, in this major, we're creating community, and all of my students are in community. And some of my students can be like, there's nothing for me here. I'm taking classes, I'm going home, I'm doing these things. So I guess that's why I'm hesitant to say yes, we absolutely can, but I'm not saying we can't. I think we just need to be more aware of how issues of power, inclusion, hierarchy, all of that works when we go into spaces and places with people that are they have, like, honestly, students have less power than us, and that may be marginalized, or this may be their, first time in a classroom. And so are they saying they feel like they're in community with us, or are we saying we're trying to build community with them? And then are they accepting of this idea of community that we present to them or not? So I don't know if that got to your answer. Again, I think you're doing some of the thinking that I'm thinking, but I do like that connection with the time and the, you know, ephemeral kind of idea about it. Because that did crop up in my head, especially considering, like, for the Kabahi River Collective, they were only in existence for 7 years. And so after they got to a certain point and thought they could do as much as they could do, they dissolved, right? And one of the things I remember reading about them was saying that they had no idea, as far as even them working in coalition, what their impact could have been outside of their coalition. I think that sometimes that's our experiences as educators in the classroom. Like, sometimes we think, yeah, that was great, but I don't think we ever get to see that full impact because of how we are positioned in the academy and in our classrooms and in our students' lives. So I don't know.
Thank
Did that answer your question, or make it at least you're mulling through a little bit more?
you. He's nodding and says it's super helpful.
Okay.
And, and I think it feeds well into a question that we got from an online attendee. And I will first pause and say I misspoke earlier. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. The blog or the chat is disabled, but the Q&A is open for questions, as Ina Machura noted. And successfully entering 2 questions, which I'm going to try to combine because I also see Ina working through some of the same types of questioning. So Ina says, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the relationships between terms like community and coalition in comparison to alliances and also communities of practice. Should the latter especially be coalitions of practice? And then also, I was wondering whether we can still teach students to build community even if community does not arise in the classroom, like equip them with tools even when the tools will serve them only later, like simulated community. Thank you.
Yeah. So, those are good questions. I think my initial thoughts would be, do we need to teach students how to build community? Because I think students often bring their own knowledges, and we have to remember, like, even as we tell them, they're part of their own communities, they're part of their own coalitions. And so I don't know that we necessarily need to teach them to build communities. I think a lot of times what we're doing is we're saying community, and we're like, I want to teach you how to be in community in the classroom. What we really mean is, I want to teach you to write collaboratively, right? Which is different from building community. Or I want to teach you how to work on a team, or I want to teach you how to operate in professional context. And so I don't want to say that we have to teach our students how to build community. I think we can teach our students how to organize in community, how to write for change, how to do all these things that um, uh, can help communities and they can take back to their own communities. But I think teaching them to build community might be something I'll struggle with. I think we can teach them to build coalitions, because I think that those, like I said, operate a little bit differently with a strategic purpose and those kinds of things. Um, and then the other question about, what was the other question? Oh my gosh.
So it was in terms of, should we be thinking about um,
Communities of practice and alliance and stuff like that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I won't say that I'm really super well, like, I know communities of practice and I know that term and I've read about it, but I'm not super well versed. I'm not sure if we need to, like, shift those terms or whatever. I think we just should be more purposeful about how we are deploying that term, especially when we haven't defined it for folks or defined it for our students. So if we define community, and I know community practice, there's lots of literature and we scholarship on, like, what is a community of practice? How does community of practice work? How does it operate? What does it mean? Where are the boundaries and borders? I think if that works, it works. We don't need to shift it to say, oh no, we're now a coalition of practice. But I think what what I was trying to articulate is that when we go into spaces and places and say we're building community or we're encouraging community or write about your community or whatever, or we try to argue that we are demonstrating, or like I tried to argue that this is a perfect example of community in the classrooms, we just need to be careful about those kinds of things, because I don't necessarily think we're always seeing community. I think within academia, there are definitely examples of coalitional work, activist work that academics are taking up and pushing forward in formal and informal spaces and places. And I would definitely call some of those coalitions and coalitions that are pushing for activist change or transformation or whatever. So I don't know if I would say we need to be, shifting the term like community of practice or whatever, but I just think just being more thoughtful about how we deploy those terms, especially for people who don't necessarily know exactly what we mean when we say community or even coalition. Does that answer your question at all?
Well, Ina is online, so
Okay.
I will wait for her to weigh in if she has a follow-up question.
Okay.
But you both Ina's question and your response had me thinking. We had Eddie Winger here a few years ago, and he was presenting some of his more contemporary thinking about communities of practice. And I think one of the things that strikes me as I think about his discussion about the ways that people cycle into and eventually perhaps out of communities of practice is that there may be things that we identify as communities of practice that really aren't, but we haven't been using, we haven't thought about coalition as an alternative way of thinking about those units. And so you've definitely got me playing with that. And I've got another question in the room for you. So
Thank you for that question.
Uh, Thank you for a marvelous and challenging set of questions. I was thinking as you talked whether or not there's a natural tendency for communities to be conservative and to think of the classic model of the academic community as being the traditional all-white male elite of the Ivy League in America. And if there isn't the danger sometimes of creating a community in a classroom that simply reinforces the lack of diversity that exists and ratifies it and gives it a kind of legitimacy without us meaning to do that. I just love to hear what you have to say about those questions.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that there's a tendency for communities to be conservative, because I think we all have all different kinds of communities, but I do think that they're like you hear about, you know, and especially, recently with the talks about critical race theory and all this, you hear like there's this imagining out there that academia is like liberal, progressive, on the cutting edge. And I can say as a Black woman, that has not been my experience. Um, so I think for me, and maybe this is reflectively, your question has me reflecting on like maybe that is a disconnect from why I didn't understand going into grad students, where everybody was like, welcome, you're part of the community now. And I'm like, where? So like thinking about that, like I do think there is a danger in re-inscribing within academic spaces and places the exclusionary and marginalizing tendencies that we see out in the world. And I don't think that academia is necessarily, and I say this with love because I love my job, but I don't think academia is necessarily naturally equipped to push back against those kinds of oppressions that we see out in the world. As a matter of fact, I think academia is poorly equipped to do that because, number one, a lot of folks have like taken up this, oh yeah, we are liberal and progressive, without thinking about, well, how are you demonstrating that you were progressive, right? Number two, the connections between governing bodies, Senate, legislation, all of that, and academia and money, right? And so that's also a problem. Number three, the bureaucracy that happens in academia. So I do think that, yeah, a lot of times we do see this reinscribing of, this white, cis, heteropatriarchal, elitist kind of thing that happens in academic spaces and places. But the thing that really gives me hope, and makes me feel and the graduate students that are doing phenomenal work, that also kind of are pushing back, against having the communities or coalitions or whatever you want to call them that we're creating in academia, pushing back against that just being the fallback, right? We're questioning, how come my professors don't look like me? We're questioning, why doesn't upper admin look like me? We're questioning, why aren't we reading X, Y, and Z on our syllabus? And why aren't we engaging in these things? Why can't I take these courses? Why can't I speak this way in class? And so I think that that gives me hope that there is actually this push to, when we're thinking about the spaces and places we're creating for our students, we're actually starting to be really critical about what actually is happening. And so that does give me hope, and I'm excited about that. And I don't know if that got to your answer or not, but
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. And ironically, the one I was going to read, the person just texted me that their question was too complex and I could ignore it. But
oh
I
no,
don't want to ignore it. I want to share it.
okay, share it.
So this is from Rien van der Musfieler. Thank you very much for an informative talk. It seems highly relevant for global education as well. I teach in Hawaii and we learn from and work with Native Hawaiian activists and scholars. Do you have suggestions for engaging and complicating these concepts in global contexts and how best to prepare students to engage across difference?
Oh, that is a big question. But I think that, it's an important question, especially when we think about, uh, you know, being interlopers in spaces and places that, we are not, you know, we might not naturally fit in, or if are we thinking about indigeneity and all of those kinds of things. And I think for me, and I don't want to necessarily speak for the whole field, but when I think about what we do to prepare our students for those global contexts and those spaces and places, I always kind of fall back on, um, making sure my students know that they can be change agents, and what does that mean. And so for me, it includes thinking about introducing them to a variety of marginalized, multiple marginalized voices and scholarship, and marginalized and multiple marginalized scholars, right? Having them come into my class and thinking about those things, reading about, issues of oppression and interlocking oppressions, reading about issues about identity, and also letting my students know that, and this is coming from teaching my students that are in professional writing and technical communication, that are actually going out into industry or whatever, like they have to make the hard choices, right? Like, so when you go into a workplace or you go into a new place or space or context, you have to make the hard and I can't make it for you. You have to make the hard choice about what you'll speak up for, what you won't speak up for, what you will engage, what you won't engage, what can you handle, what can you sleep with at night, what will you do for that paycheck, what won't you do for that company, right? And so I think just being really honest with our students about these overlapping oppressions that they will see or they might experience or they might come to face with, that they have to actually think through these things before they go into that organization, before they go into that company, before they sign on, is really important. I also think about really important work that international scholars in my work are doing, in my field are doing, about, opening up these conversations on a more global level. So I will defer to them as the experts when it comes to questions about those. But, for instance, Dr. Godwin Egboka, he's at the University of Houston downtown. He does some phenomenal work about social justice, localization, intercultural communication, decoloniality. Dr. Josephine Wawima, who is at the University of Washington as well. Dr. Kana Uluk Ichikuyuk, who is now at the, I'm going to blank, University of West Virginia, I believe. I could be wrong. I might need to correct that. But an Indigenous scholar that is also doing this work to get us thinking about decoloniality and indigeneity. So there's lots of people who are definitely more well-versed in that and better able to answer that question. I always defer to those folks. There's a lot of work going on in those areas talking about how do we prepare our students for issues like that. And I think they have some really great examples. And really great suggestions and models for us as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. I think you've given us a lot to think about. There's a lot of energy in the room around this, and I'm eager for the conversations to continue locally. And I'll share really quickly that Maureen responded that your suggestions are great and resonate with our focus on identity. Thank you so much. And if you do have a chance to share any of those names, I'll be sure to pass them on to.
I can put them in the chat.
That'd be perfect.
And then you can share them out.
Thank you. And I just want to add, I know that there were some additional questions in the room, and we are nearing the end of our time. So I hope that anyone who didn't have a chance to discuss their question will reach out and that we can continue to engage in this conversation. I think it's really interesting to think about community building versus coalition building in the context of conversations about relationship-rich campuses. And so it's really, there's a lot here that we can continue to think about and act on. And I also want to acknowledge we've got some students in the room, and I'm really interested to hear their take on this conversation as those of us here in the room are able to continue our conversations today and tomorrow. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for joining us. I wanted to ask everyone to give you one more round of acknowledgement.